Welcome. You're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lorilee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere else you get your podcast. Today's guest is Karen Gross. Karen is a trauma educator and author of Breakaway Learners and Trauma Doesn't Stop at the School Door, as well as her most recent book, Mending Education, Finding Hope, Creativity, and Mental Wellness in Times of Trauma. Karen, thank you so much for joining me today. And again, I really appreciate having you.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you again and nice to be with your listeners.
I know that this most recent book is kind of talking about times of trauma, like being able to mend the education during times. We are living in some times of trauma. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about what you really focused on in this book.
So the interesting thing about the book is that it was intended to share with readers what we had learned that was positive from the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative about the pandemic was that it was completely destructive to education as we knew it. But in truth, there were positives. But here's the really interesting thing. The hope was that the book would give us guidance for the next crisis or trauma. Who knew that it would be upon us so fast?
Mm-hmm.
And so while it's 5 years from when the pandemic started, the book came out in September of 2024. And by any measure, the world as we knew it is struggling, and people are experiencing enormous trauma, regardless of your political persuasion. And so, in a really ironic sense, the book has become even more relevant than it was when it was originally written. And that certainly wasn't an expectation that we would encounter such difficult times so soon, but we have. And I think the book helps us think about our present situation.
And I really do love the fact that you're talking about the positive impacts. Because I know for a lot of people, they could only think about the negative impacts of COVID or any traumatic experience, right? It's those negative experiences that kind of stick with you more so than the positive ones. Can you talk a little bit about, because I mean, we are still dealing with the repercussions of COVID. I think a lot of kids had a hard time really trying to focus on home, basically doing school through Zoom or, via the web. Um, so I'm kind of curious, what did you talk, what would you focus on?
So, first of all, the idea of focusing on the positives from any trauma is hugely significant
Mm-hmm.
because we actually can learn and grow from trauma. Let's start with this. Trauma doesn't go away.
No.
So we have a choice when confronted with it, whether it's in our personal lives or our work lives or in the world, to let that trauma control our narrative moving forward, or can we use it in ways that help us manage and be better able to not only move forward, but to be better ourselves as a consequence? And one of the things I say to people is, I am who I am, not despite the trauma in my life, but because of it. In other words, I've learned, and I hope to share with others the capacity to learn from bad things, traumatic things that happen in our lives. So in terms of kids, yes, school, when it restarted, didn't allow us to go back to where we were, even though I think we thought we were going back there. Instead, it brought us to a new place, and we've got to find ways that we can integrate what we learned from the pandemic into education now. But of course, there have been other changes in education, including the dismantling of the United States Department of Education, all of which impacts how schools are functioning across our nation. So I would like to say that if we don't have hope, if we don't have hope for our students, if we don't have hope for education, then we're in a really bad place. Because at the end of the day, hope is what allows you to move forward. It's what
Hmm.
gives you the power to believe that the future can be better than the present.
Oh, that's so well said. So well said. Um, and so for you as a trauma educator, what did you see that we could take away from the experience of the pandemic?
So in the book, we reference 30 what we call pandemic positives. There is a report that was issued by the Brookings Institute that said there were over 3,000 pandemic positives across the globe. But I'm happy to share a few of those positives with you. Um,
Absolutely.
so here's one. One of the things that educators did during the pandemic is they were creative. They found ways to make a system like online learning function, even though many of them hadn't had detailed professional development. But educators were immensely creative, creative in how they taught, creative in what they taught, creative in how they engaged with students. So I would say one of the pluses out of a crisis is the emergence of creativity.
Oh, I love that.
Here's another positive. We had to communicate more and better. When kids weren't with us in person, we had to find ways to communicate with them. And if they were older, find ways to communicate with wherever they were. And in the case of younger students, communicate with them and their parents. We upped our communicative ability. How important is that?
Probably
Critically
one of the most important
important.
things.
Right. And yet, when we return to brick and mortar learning, our ongoing efforts to communicate have diminished. So we didn't learn and engage with what we had done as a carry forward mechanism. Instead, we thought, oh, you communicate more in a crisis, and then later we don't have to communicate as much. No, no, actually, the lesson is communicate all the time, more and better and well, so that people feel connected. And I'll leave you with one more of the pandemic positives, well, maybe two, that we
Okay, I'd love
identified.
to. Yeah.
Okay, so one is we thought about how to use space differently during the pandemic. So brick and mortar schools were closed. We had online learning. And many educators figured out, oh, there's some benefit to these chats that allow students to communicate as material is being taught. And we have breakout rooms and chat rooms where students can go and work on projects separately or in small groups or with or without one or more educators.
Mhm.
When we returned to brick and mortar learning, that remarkable online capacity didn't get translated into physical space. You can have the equivalent of a chat by using your whiteboard or even using some device that you have. You can create breakout rooms by dividing students into pods within a big room and even provide some screens to make that more possible. In other words, why didn't we take all the benefits of what online learning gave us and translate it and use it in the brick and mortar environment?
Yeah.
And here's my last observation. Well, not for this whole podcast, but just for the moment. Um, when we were online, many of the sort of standardized testing that had been done was eliminated. And the data show that between kindergarten and 12th grade, students take about 100 standardized tests. Think about that.
Mm.
That's about 10 to 12 a year. When those weren't offered, educators found other remarkable ways to assess student learning. They did portfolios, they did videos, they did oral presentations, they did different kinds of non-standardized methods for evaluating student learning. And we can debate what we should measure in terms of learning. But as soon as schools reopened, all those new ways of assessing got left behind, and we returned to standardized tests as the measure of student learning. What a loss that we didn't incorporate remarkably thoughtful ways of measuring student learning, and instead returned to measures that by any estimate are flawed, particularly for students who are struggling or traumatized or discriminated against or living in poverty. And so, unfortunately, we regressed rather than learning from the pandemic.
Oh, excuse me. So do you feel like this book is for educators to kind of continue on that path of creativity and growth and new ways of learning?
So I hope it provides a roadmap for taking what they learned, may not have named, but what they learned during the pandemic and carrying it forward for the benefit of all students. And it should prepare them, if you absorb what you learned from the pandemic, it should help you when the next set of crises come along, because instead of reinventing what you learned, you would have it right there, ready to be employed. Now that hasn't happened, but the goal is to give people a toolbox that they can use that identifies what they learned, put what they learned in a box, like a
Hmm.
little box, and then allows them to keep that box to use in the now and then to use when the next crisis occurs.
During the pandemic, I think a lot of people started really focusing on their mental health, right? They weren't able to kind of go and distract themselves with with other friends. I mean, it was a very kind of isolating time in many ways. Um, do you feel that tr people who may have had experienced any traumas previously or were able to kind of focus on their mental health or mental wellness?
I mean, you're raising a really important point, which is that the pandemic put a focus on mental wellness because our mental wellness was declining.
Mm-hmm.
And the data are clear on this as well, that our mental wellness declined during the pandemic and hasn't exactly surged forward in good ways afterwards.
Mm.
But here's what's very hard for me to accept. One of the things that happened during the pandemic is that educators saw that it's very hard to learn and learn well when you're struggling with your mental wellness.
Yeah.
Students would disengage. Students would not show up on screen. They would sign in but not show up. Students would struggle with material. And educators saw firsthand the lives that students were living, whether the student was young or older. They saw the environment in which they were learning. They heard in the background the distractions. They saw how students looked. They actually spent time asking, "Are you okay?
Mm.
What can I do to help you?" But when we returned to brick and mortar learning, some of that focus on mental wellness didn't have the attention it had during the pandemic. And so our mental wellness isn't improving. We've lost the insight that we had. So think about it this way. During the pandemic, we saw that content learning and social and emotional learning are intertwined. And you couldn't teach content without quality social and emotional readiness. Now move forward, we've disconnected them again. And we have social and emotional learning over here, castigated by many as not being relevant, which is a flawed position, and content learning over here. Well, here's the real truth. You can't learn if you're not mentally well.
Yeah,
I
a
mean, it's a
100%.
basic premise. So integrate social and emotional wellness into content learning so that our students can become their very best selves.
Mm, wow. Yeah, it's funny because the focus at my children's school is social emotional learning. That is like their whole mission. Is we picked the school for a reason, right?
Ah,
Uh,
good choice.
yes, we love the school and that is their main focus is, kind of teaching the kids from the inside out. But I do feel that I mean, it gets tough because I feel like a majority of schools, you know, the social emotional learning and content learning is not that way at all. And as a matter of fact, it's like gone by the wayside. I'm not sure. Do all, especially public schools, have counselors or guy, someone who's there to kind of work with children through that. And like you were saying, teachers were able to see the children in the environment they were learning in. Do you believe that many of those teachers who saw that, you know, were able to get help for them now that we're back at school?
So there are a lot of really important points embedded in what you said. Let me,
Sorry.
no, let me see if I can address some of them. Um, I think social and emotional learning has become a political issue. It's not a political issue. It's an
No.
educational issue. It's an issue about learning. And whether you're blue or red or purple, we should all care about our students' learning. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how long it takes them or what approaches we need to use, as long as they learn. And so, why not use every possible avenue to help all our children learn well? So, I would say take social and emotional learning out of the political arena and move it where it belongs, which is the educational arena, about learning theory and understanding how best to help all of our students. Now, when we got back to brick and mortar schools, it turns out that the resources weren't sufficient to, to provide the needed mental health support for many, many students. Counselors were too small in number to meet the needs of students returning from the pandemic. And educators who were not counselors by training were struggling to figure out, oh, how do they provide the kind of support that students need? Now, what's sad is that during the pandemic, we ramped up resources to help people, outside counselors, outside support systems, community support systems, lots of ways to help ensure that our students got what they needed in the online environment. We even created buses with internet and educators and materials that went out to communities. But as soon as we returned, all of that, not all, I'm slightly exaggerating, but
Hmm.
much of what happened reverted to where we were. Couldn't we have buses now that went out to communities with internet and educators and books and helped kids? I don't understand why we're not learning from what we garnered in a pandemic that would help us be better at what we do. we should take those lessons and employ them regularly and often and with pride that a bad situation taught us something really good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be ideal, right? But you did say something. How do we take education, social emotional learning, um, and make it a nonpartisan issue? Because I think that's tough, because I think more and more than ever, we're politicizing almost everything. How do we go back to not doing that and not only kind of separating these ideas for what they are?
Isn't that really the question of the moment, right? Not just in education, but more generally. So I I think in a society as divided as ours at the present moment, it would be useful to think about the values that really matter. And for me, and I hope for many, many others, educating our children, educating the next generation, ensuring that the world that we live in is better for the next generation is a central theme. So, getting rid of the Department of Education for me sends a message that education isn't that important and we'll leave it to the states. But not every state has the same quality of education, the same
That's right.
resources for education, the same population that they're educating. And it seems to me, couldn't we just step back and ask the question, don't we want to leave the world better than we found it? Don't we want to leave it in good hands? And then the question is, how do we get there? That actually should be a moral and social, educational issue. It's not a political issue. It should be something on which we generally agree. So there's a guy named James Ryan who um, has been the president of the University of Virginia. Before that, he was the dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And he wrote a book called Wait, What? And Life's Other Essential Questions. By the way, should be getting royalties from him. Number of times that I've recommended his book. But in any event, one of the questions he asks is this: couldn't we at least agree that dot dot dot? I would say that to people as we reflect on education. In times of trauma and moving forward, couldn't we at least agree that educating our students, howsoever we have to do it, is what really matters? I would hope if
I
we
would hope
posed
as
it
well.
that way, that we could agree on that. But at a minimum, we need to find those ways in which we agree, not the ways in which we disagree. They are plentiful, to be sure, but there have to be things about which we agree.
Right. It's the same thing. It's like digging for the positives, and I think for so many, that's it, like you were saying, there's so many negatives. It's easy to bring out the negatives, but that's not what we're trying to do here. That's not what's challenging us or making us better. Um,
I think we get a perverse pleasure out of finding the disagreeable areas rather than recognizing the positives. So, by recognizing the positives in the areas we share together, that's not controversial,
right.
that's political. That's human decency. So
Mhm.
I would say we need to shift how we address issues in the larger scheme of things, but even in smaller ways to help our students become the best version of themselves that they can be. How important, I mean, isn't that at the end of the day what really matters? Helping
Yeah.
people become their best selves?
Yeah, 100%. And but you said these smaller ways. What are these sh smaller shifts that we can do as parents, as educators, as administrators? What are those
I
little
hope
things?
this book, which is certainly valuable to educators, but can be valuable to parents and to people in businesses and in healthcare, which is to say, let's pause long enough to think about what we should have at the core of programs that we should adopt or adapt or use. So there are really three things. It forms a three-legged stool. You need creativity, you need connectedness, and you need community. That's what you need. If you've got those three, then you can do lots.
Mm.
So if we say that, when we think about new things to do or evaluate existing things, say, is there something creative in there? Is there connectedness in there? And is there engagement with and use of and reciprocity among community? And if we use that three-legged stool as our guidepost, there's lots we can do. We just have to identify what we need to do and then deploy this three-legged stool as the guidepost moving forward.
Yeah, I think about, I have friends whose children are in the public education system, and there's so much that can be done when, groups of parents rally together. And so it is hard work. I'm not saying I feel like I see my friends and they're really getting in there, but then you can see like the fruits of their labor. Um, and like anything wonderful, there's work, there's challenges, there's difficulties that you face, but I think you're right. When you name those three things, it was like that's exactly what I see within my community with people making some changes in their own schools.
And I think if we acknowledge their efforts and encourage people, that helps too, because it's really hard to succeed in isolation. I
Okay.
mean, the sort of individualistic approach to things, which Robert Putnam called America's bowling alone, doesn't really work to better all of us. Instead, we do way better if we bowl together,
Hmm.
even though it's hard work to engage with others. We don't always have to agree. What we have to agree is to be decent and respectful and kind,
Yeah.
all of which is immensely difficult in hard times. But some
Hmm.
of it is we forget, I think, in the midst of all these struggles and in the midst of trauma, the value of hope, the value of creativity, the value of connectedness, and the value of community. They matter. They
Yeah.
really matter. And so if we can identify them, if we can name them, then maybe we can tame them, as in
Mm.
use them. But if we don't name them, then we kind of forget about them.
Yeah.
So for me, the power rests in giving people a voice to understand what they did so well during the pandemic and empower them to use it in a world where, well, sadly, it's now more trauma, but to use it in a world after the pandemic.
Hmm. Absolutely. You talked about you Mending Education, your most recent book. You have Breakaway Learners and Trauma Doesn't Stop at the School Door. But we were talking, these are great books for parents and educators, but you also wrote a children's book.
So I've actually written a children's book series. I've written 12 children's books.
You are a very busy woman.
Um, the children's book series is being reissued because it's gone out of print and a number of the original publishers, which were small publishing houses, have gone out of business. So it's
Hmm.
being reissued. It's called Lady Lucy's Quest. That's the first book. And then she goes on a series of quests. But here's the story, and I want to share it with you because it encapsulates what we've been talking about. So there's a little girl in medieval times who wants to be a knight in the Middle Ages. And she's told, no, no, girls can't be knights. And she asks them where it says that in the book of rules. And they can't find a rule. So she says, let me take the tests of knighthood and let's see if I can pass. So she takes two of the tests, and through creative and connected ways, apropos of what I've suggested in my adult book, she succeeds. And now she's facing the very last test. And the senior-most knight says to her, share with us something that you've done that's courageous. And at first, she's like thinking, oh, well, I haven't slain a dragon. I haven't fought in a war. I haven't done all these things that other people have done. And then it dawns on her, wait a second, I have done something immensely courageous. And so she calls everybody together and she says, I have an answer to that test. The most courageous thing I've done is try to become a knight. She found her voice. She
Mm.
found what mattered. She was able to share her courage. And so she becomes a knight. And the other books are her going out on quests with her little team of a unicorn and a dragon to solve problems in unique and different and creative and bold ways that make a difference to her community. So this book series lives the values that undergird mending education, but it lives them in ways that one can share them with one's children. And there are kids who have put this book under their pillow, who've carried it with them in their backpacks. And when I originally did it, I had Lady Lucy dolls and puppets and things.
Mm.
Decided, okay, I'm going to come up with another doll and some puppets and read the books to children around the globe. And my hope is that in doing that, I take the values that undergird mending education and enable parents and kids and educators to share them and talk about them and ideally live them.
Ah, what a beautiful, beautiful thing. That is so wonderful. Thank you so much. I do want to ask if there's anything that you'd like to add.
I just want to say how powerful I think the work that you do is. And
Thank
I've
you.
been honored to have many of the things I've written appear in your monthly magazine, for which I'm deeply grateful. And I
Mm.
hope that your readers not only find value in what I do, but I am sure they find value in what you do and the efforts you make to raise awareness about trauma and its impact on people and the lives they lead.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the work that you do and just the work you do for educators and parents and children alike. And so, I mean, I have to say, I wouldn't have you on this podcast if I wasn't so in awe of the work that you do.
So on that mutual admiration thing, um, I look forward to doing this again. Maybe when
Absolutely.
the children's books are finally out again, we can talk and I can share them with your readers.
I would love that. Thank you so much. And thank you again for taking the time because I know you are very busy and you're always traveling.
So I
So
should
thank
add
you.
something fun about my travels, okay?
Okay, yes, let's do that.
So that's a little off track, but not that far. So I two recent trips. I went to a girls' school in Kenya
Mm.
that helps girls in the Maasai tribe. I went to a place called Nasaruni Academy in the far out in the outskirts of Kenya. And in the Maasai culture, historically, girls ages 10 to 12 were married to older men, and they were, in essence, sold off into marriage at a very young age. But there's a new movement within the Maasai tribe to help these girls stay in school so that they don't get married off early. And I worked in
Yeah.
one of those schools that was helping these girls appreciate the value of education and the capacity that they have to grow and flourish as young and then older women. And so that was an immensely rewarding effort. And I've agreed to go back on several occasions to continue to help the girls and help the educators there who help them. And then I went to the United Kingdom to celebrate the 25th anniversary of my very first book.
Oh.
And I have to say, I'm young enough, I hope, to have been astute enough to listen to what people thought had been the influence of a book written many moons ago. And here's what I took away from several events when I was in the United Kingdom celebrating this first book. First of all, I've learned a lot in 25 years. So I had to answer the question, would I write the same book if I had to do it again?
Mm.
But here's what was really powerful, that there were two generations of scholars there, people in their 50s and then people in their 30s, for whom this book had influenced them and their scholarship. And I don't know what more one can ask for as an educator than to realize that two generations have found the work that you wrote many moons ago to be relevant in their life today. So I would say those two trips have been remarkably positive in a world where we're struggling. And I'm deeply appreciative of the opportunities they gave me to realize what values govern my world and the efforts that I make day to day.
Wow. Well, powerful and inspiring. Thank you for sharing that, because that is incredible work. So, well,
Onward we go.
onward we go.
That's how I end my emails.
I
Onward.
know, I do. I see that in your emails.
Yeah. All
Oh,
the
yes. Well, thank you. That was Karen Gross, author of Mending Education. For more information on Karen and where to purchase her latest book, as well as her others, you can check out the show notes. April's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Karen is a frequent contributor to the magazine, so you can also check out any of those issues. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can also find past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. So if you haven't already, please sign up for the email list. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm Lorilee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.